This week on Today in Space, we are doing another episode here on the Boeing Starliner spacecraft. If you followed it at all, we've done two episodes about this, episode 350 and 351. Here on 353, we're going to be diving into this a little bit more. We've learned more, and there's a lot to break down. You've got two camps, extreme camps, that are speaking very loudly. One saying Boeing can't do anything right, they should cancel the program, nobody should ever fly on that spacecraft. And then you've got the Boeing side, which is saying, you are dumb, you don't know what you're talking about, sit back and let the experts figure out what they're going to do. It's perfectly safe. And we are of the opinion that it is something very much in between those two, not as extreme. First, we're going to tell you what happened. We're going to break down what we're learning and what that means. But we're also going to take the engineer's perspective. We're going to take you in the seat, as I've been an engineer for years now. I know what it means to be in the room with engineers. There is this really interesting dynamic of what it is to be an engineer in the room, and this Boeing story with NASA is a great example to break that down. So that's what we're going to do. Thank you for joining us, and let's talk more about Boeing Starliner, what's really going on, and what to expect moving forward. Let's do it. All right, everybody, welcome to the podcast. I am your host, as always, Alex G. Orfanos. We're here to talk about Boeing. And if you're tired of it, I do apologize, but I think there's so much richness in this. And if you are tired of it, you can always email us at todayinspacepodcast@gmail.com or hit us up on any of our social media accounts, Today in Space Pod on Instagram and Twitter, Today in Space on TikTok. And yeah, Twitter is actually where I'm the most active right now. Today in Space Pod on Instagram. You can let us know what you want us to cover, but I want to spend some more time on this, but taking a different approach. Right now, it's so easy to jump on Boeing and blame them for everything that's going on here. It's been a very strange time, and I think that there's really an interesting story here with what it means to be the engineer in this situation. Those are not necessarily the people that we are hearing from, but that is where the decision is going to come from. It's from engineers and engineering data and the human dynamic of all of that, where the culture within NASA is speaking up when they do not believe that they are as confident as Boeing seems to be about this Starliner. So we're going to dive into real quick because we want to talk about what happened. We have this report here from Eric Berger from ARS Technica. Now, there are a lot of people from the old guard of space, say the Boeing hardcores, and even some NASA hardcores who are very upset with Eric Berger. But in our opinion, he is doing fantastic reporting. And all these reporters who are pushing the issue and asking more questions and trying to extract more info, because we're all so limited from the outside, right? I don't have internal resources inside of this. I'm using the same publicly available data that everyone else has to assess this from the outside as someone who has an aerospace engineering degree, has been following the space industry heavily for the last decade. For me, I had smelled something strange. So for Eric Berger to go out of his way to report this with 3 different sources is amazing that he's doing that. That's good journalism. That's taking a risk for the truth. And we are 100% on page for that. And if he gets it wrong, he gets it wrong, but he took that risk for the truth. And at the end of the day, as the engineer, that is, if you're fighting for something as an engineer, a person in STEM, or whatever career it is, you're fighting for the truth of the situation, not necessarily your version of the truth or what you believe is the right way forward. And so kudos to Eric Berger for doing this. And ARS did a great little description here about why things blew up at the beginning of August here. Here are some of the points that ARS can confidently report based on multiple sources. It says here in this article from August 1st, NASA keeps delaying a decision. The flight readiness review meeting had been scheduled for today, August 1st, several days in advance, but it was canceled. And then NASA put out a blog post update that said, following the completion of Starliner's return planning, which is expected to continue into next week, more information will be shared about the agency's return readiness review preparations and subsequent media briefing. And, this past week on the 5th, we got that media briefing, but I continue. Back to the article. NASA issued a $266,678 task reward to SpaceX on July 14th. This was 4 days after that last episode where we covered the media briefing. So 4 days after that media briefing, SpaceX was given that award for a special study for emergency response. And NASA had said that it wasn't directly related to Starliner's problems, but two of the sources for ARS said that it really was. So some internal debate on that, according to ARS. And although the study entailed work on flying more than 4 crew members on home on Crew Dragon, which had happened earlier in the past year with Frank Rubio, astronaut Frank Rubio, and the Soyuz MS-22, where there was a Soyuz capsule that had a leak. And so they had to prepare for the fact that they needed to find an extra seat to bring Frank Rubio home on a Dragon, and they actually took a seat from a Soyuz or the padding and figured out how they could do that. So SpaceX had already kind of been thinking about this and prepping and thinking, all right, if we had to do this, how would we bring someone home for a Soyuz that's broken? They were given this contract, and it obviously raised some eyebrows. And then SpaceX was working on a scenario in which 2 or 4 astronauts would launch on Crew 9, which is now officially part of the game plan after the latest media conference. So basically what they did, because you've got to think, the International Space Station is a port, right? It is a place where now we have vehicles coming in and out between the supply vehicles like Northrop Grumman, and you've got the Progress from Russia, then the Crew Dragon, and now Starliner. And so there's so many, and I'm probably missing one, but there's a lot of spacecraft coming in and out. So there's only a certain amount of docks, and there's more beneficial places to put it if there's one incoming versus one that's staying. For Crew 9, they've now prepared for the fact that they might only send 2 astronauts on board, so there are 2 seats available for Sonny and Butch to come back. So they've prepped for either scenario, whether they continue with the 4 and they keep the astronauts up there long term for a whole other expedition, which I think is February of 2025 was the date that could be the longest. There's so many things that need to be planned, but this is a good thing. NASA was able to flex their plan and have options, which in the long scheme of this commercial crew program, we have 2 spacecraft. One is still, the Starliner is still being developed. But now we've got these 2 spacecraft, right? That now there's one as a backup. That is a huge, huge thing. And it just helps with mission planning and it makes it so that there's no reason to put astronauts in undue harm if there is another spacecraft to send them home. And that reality, as the risk and uncertainty has started to grow here with, is Starliner ready to come home with crew? Now it's clear that the option of sending crew home on board a Dragon is much more appealing than risking an unknown amount of risk that seems to be widening over time as more questions are asked about sending them home on Starliner. What should be the most valuable part of this decision, which is making sure that as much risk as possible is managed for these astronauts, i.e., we do everything possible to make sure that these astronauts are safe. Like, that is the thing that should be considered the most here, and not someone's program survival or anything like that. But it's just so good to see NASA fight for that. I mean, with the history of the space shuttle program and the lives lost in the Apollo program, I mean, this program has spent a ton of money on putting together these spacecraft together so they could be human rated and fly. Boeing has been rooting out issues and getting there. But they have a spacecraft that is docked, and it probably can go home completely safely. But there is a risk, and so there's nothing wrong with sending home the spacecraft. I honestly believe, and there's others out there like Eric Berger and others who've discussed this, that if they send home crew on a Crew Dragon, they send home Sonny and Butch on the Crew Dragon, and then the Starliner comes home and returns robotically without crew on board and is safe, it is almost 100%, it's not 100%, but it's almost 100% likely that NASA will spend money to do one more crew test flight to root out any of the things they were worried about, implement things that fix it, and they will get funded again. NASA has already spent many, many millions of dollars on Starliner, and they love having an operational Crew Dragon, and I think they also love having options. And so we're in this new era of NASA that's never happened in human spaceflight, if I'm not mistaken, where we have multiple spacecraft at the ISS to make this decision. You don't have to send them home. So that is the big crux of what we've learned from last time and where we are today and where we think this is going to go. Now, as far as the problem itself, the White Sands testing showed that there's a thing called a poppet, which has this Teflon seal, and it's part of this RCS thruster's fluid system, right? Which helps the engine provide a thrust. And this poppet, when the thrusters were overheating, was showing to extrude, or more simply, expand, and it appeared that pieces of this poppet Teflon seal were breaking up and finding their way into the fluid system of the rocket. That could cause issues down the line, and it's very difficult to truly understand how each of these poppet Teflon seals expands based on what temperature, based on what position it's on in the spacecraft. But overheating makes it expand, and there's a risk that debris can fall off and cause issues. Now, even though this is a very small part and stuff like that, it is something that is unexplained. It just adds more concern and risk to the whole scenario. So, it was really interesting to see the people who came out of their way because of reporting like this by ARS Technica and plenty of others, or reporters who are pushing the bounds of the questions they're asking, potentially, having a relationship end if someone took it the wrong way from the Boeing side or from the NASA side. And more and more people like Jordan Noon, who we've had on here before. He was the CTO of Relativity Space and is currently a co-founder over at Embedded Ventures. Even he was saying that the test doesn't really show the data or test against the thing that we're ultimately worried about. So I'm going to read that exchange right now. All right, so this is on July 27th. Boeing Space put out a tweet after they had done a docked hot fire test in combination with the test down in White Sands. And they said, during today's docked hot fire test, Starliner thrusters performed at peak thrust rating values, peak thrust, and the helium system remained stable, because remember, the helium system also had leaks before, so they were aware of this and they were dealing with it. But apparently it stayed stable. They said data will be reviewed and included in flight rationale for the crew flight test undocking from space station and return to Earth. Jordan Noon retweeted this with his quote that said, "This test is insufficient to demonstrate full performance of the RCS thrusters. The thruster issues manifest at high duty cycle operations or long continuous operation. Both of those are required before and during re-entry. Performance is demonstrated by a variety of factors inclusive of duty cycle and duration performance, not just thrust." And so he goes on here to explain, and I highly recommend looking at this, but I want to just skim through this so we can get through this, and as always, the links will be in this episode. But he says, peak thrust, in quotes, means nothing. It's not even a throttleable thruster. Duration and duty cycle matter here to demonstrate that these thrusters will perform nominally and reliably during re-entry, and those can't be tested reasonably while connected to the ISS. So the point he's making here is that this value we're using for success, peak thrust, it doesn't mean something in relation to the concern, which is when these reaction control system thrusters are trying to orient the spacecraft so that the heat shield stays correctly as it's going in. And there's other periods here too, right? Like, and it's being used a lot, high duty cycle and duration, and it gets overheated, which is how the last one failed. How is this test that you're doing connected to the ISS actually testing the thing we're concerned about? Very reasonable, and from an engineer's perspective, that is a great question. And while it may be the awkward thing to say in the room as the whole team is getting ready to do this thing and rah rah rah, like, it's not fun to be the person that has to be the buzzkill, but these are people's lives in stake, right? It's not fun when you're in a business and you're saying something that the people in the business don't like, and there's nobody's lives, which is just, can we sell this product, right? People don't like it then. So you can imagine the stress level of saying this publicly on a platform like Twitter. But clearly Jordan was moved as I've known him, and through his results of building rocket engines with relativity, it's clearly something important enough that he felt like he had to speak out. So all these people who have been brave enough, like Eric Berger, Jordan Noonan, and there's so many other people who have spoken out, who really have a lot to lose by doing so. There's a lot of bravery and courage that's involved in that. So I just wanted to bring that up because that's a big part of being a great engineer, is even if you're the only person in the room that sees something that doesn't look quite right, if you're fighting for the truth, and not necessarily like your own survival, like your own position in the company, like you're just like, no, I need to bring this up because it's the right thing to bring up, because I'm noticing something that people aren't. So again, huge kudos, because that's very tough. Now, Jim May Jr., who is a rocket scientist and a part of this program, who has a personal account, says peak thrust means the force value was measured to be 100% of the designed thrust, where degraded thruster performance was not always at 100%. It doesn't take a throttleable thruster to have a difference in force output. So we're in a scientific duke out here, which is all good. That's, part of being an engineer and being in the room, and there's what you think being an engineer is before you get to school, and even when you're in school, right? You have this idea as you're learning about engineering that things are going to go a certain way, and then you get to the business or the institute or the research center or wherever it is. I've been more of the commercial side of things personally in my experience, but these things happen, and they can be healthy and they can be toxic, but we'll talk about that in a second here. So Jordan responds, please explain how testing at peak thrust, if you can even call it that for a non-throttleable thruster, indicates health of the thruster for long duration or high duty cycle burns, which is where the issues have manifested. Jim May responds, this test was to determine if any thrusters were firing at less than 100%, which was seen when hot firing some earlier in the flight. Long duration high duty cycle tests were performed at White Sands. Results will be compared between the two and previous flight data. And Jordan says, as mentioned in my post, the performance anomalies manifested after long duration burns and high duty cycle burns. So getting peak thrust from a test during conditions that historically have always resulted in peak thrust means nothing for what happens during the conditions that have historically caused problem. And then Jim May says here, when looking at this in previous flights for Starliner or for other vehicles, not all thrusters which have been seen to have performance degradation go back to 100% later. This would be a final check for that data point. And so basically, Jordan brings over this idea of survivorship bias here in World War II, where planes were hit. So basically, all these planes that got shot up and then survived and made it back, the prompt there was, oh, okay, so let's add more armor to the area that these ships that survived came back, instead of maybe looking at it as, Well, what made the planes that didn't come home crash or not make it home? Where did they get hit? And let's focus on that area, not the planes that made it home. So, a different perspective on how you approach the next problem, right? Then Jim ends up posting the July 10th conference as kind of a defense of what was discussed. And this is where I found Jordan's tweet. He says, "This reviews the root cause of seal degradation from the increased temperatures. The debris from that seal can cause downstream flow problems, as has been on your test stands and in flight. Doing a single thruster firing demonstration that the flow problem does not currently exist in the other thrusters, but does nothing to show that a damaged, degraded seal will not have debris come loose from the expected cycles on the valves for the remainder of the mission. You have zero rationale to say that can't happen because it's already happened in one thruster with fewer cycles than this total mission demands." And I will leave you to check out the rest of that because it probably won't make a good podcast if we keep just reading tweets here. But to break that down, this is one of the toughest things about being an engineer. And some of the guidelines that the mantras I live by for good engineering. Number one is that you can never be 100% confident in anything, and you're never going to reach 100% completion of things being perfect, right? And so you live in a world of 85% and higher. Basically, the idea here is that, you can make a bunch of work to bring something from an idea to reality. You can get to 85% really quickly and within budget. And then that next thing of going from 85 to 90 or 85 to 95 or 85 to 99.99999%. That is where your big sunk cost of time and effort, you're going to spend so much more time on that final 10%, 5%, 15%, whatever it is, on getting it there. And so at a certain point, especially for a company that has profit to consider and costs, I mean, Boeing themselves has spent $1.6 billion on this, and so they've lost money on this program. So there is and understandably so, from a survival perspective of the company and the program, people's jobs, there is obviously a tendency to have much more of a bias towards this needs to happen. I mean, I saw it in the comment section for the first two videos on YouTube. Granted, assuming they are actual real people, but we saw in there that people are legitimately saying that Starliner must succeed. And that in itself goes against that good engineering. That is assuming that you are picking up a 100% confidence. And even the way that a lot of the media was portrayed and the unexplained confidence that Boeing has had in this when there are issues, and then the lack of discussing it. I know being a space hardcore and going into the comment sections of different podcasts like Space and Things that do a great job. I mean, there are people working for NASA or used to work for Boeing or worked at Boeing that basically were saying, you don't know anything. You just need to wait and listen to what the experts decide. And, I don't think that is appropriate with human spaceflight. It's a different thing if you're talking about, a technology demonstration and sending up an uncrewed flight or a spacecraft. You can take other risks with robotic technology that you cannot do with human beings. And ultimately, it's NASA's decision. And as we found out, it's ultimately the administrator's decision. This is a decision for NASA to make, not for Boeing. And now that it's become so public and that the internal community of NASA has spoken up so much, this is now going further, and we're learning more about this whole process. And I think this is a good thing. I think ultimately NASA is going to be better for this. But this is what being an engineer is like. It can be brutal. I think that's why so many engineers end up losing, as male engineers particularly here, losing their hair and look completely stressed and overworked all the time. Uh, and part of it is because of this slug of interpersonal people relationships and dealing with data. To explain that a little bit more, for those who are not engineers, when you're an engineer, and I've had the luck to work at a few different places where I've been an engineer, I've been in charge of data, and I've been in those meetings to bring that data to leadership and for them to help make a decision on whatever it is that we're working on. And that to me is very exciting. I love doing alpha testing or just any kind of testing. I grew up, my first job was an R&D engineer, research and development. So I absolutely love that whole thing. And, for me, having data is the most important thing. And the great thing about being an engineer and having a culture that is data driven is you can use the data as the conflict point, right? If you are able to create great data and then bring that data, filter it out to show where the risk is, right? That's what an engineer is doing at its best, right? At their best, an engineer is gathering solid data through rigorous testing that is trying to root out the problems, and then you are analyzing the risk of this to whatever it is. In this case, we're talking about human beings returning home. And Jordan Noon's point here, and what I would guess is the internal NASA discussion point here, is in the risk of all of that analysis, everything that we learn about the poppets and the seals and the flow disruption of this thruster, and then the tests that were done to try and root that out, his point is that test did not root out this scenario. So that risk and the time you took to express how risky it actually is, that test wasn't even set up in order to extract that. So you, in some ways, you could argue, are fluffing the data, or at the very least, the data you're gathering is not giving you the right scope of the problem. And so, in a very healthy engineering environment, you can go into a meeting and express that data, and then you can talk about how the data was gathered, and then if you all agree that the data gathering was good, then you start talking about the overall arching, like, what does this mean? And what decision are we going to make next, right? Is there now new risk that we need to consider? And then how do we mitigate that for the next stage? And the next stage here is sending the crew home. And so clearly, as we found out through reporting and through the way that things have changed since July 10th, that there are people in NASA who have seen the data in real extents, and they are saying that there is now new risk and we are not comfortable with that when we have the other option of sending them home on another spacecraft. So for me, and how engineering can be, I think that dissent or questioning that is happening in NASA is the best case scenario for spaceflight moving forward. I think this is a really great nexus point where those voices are being listened to. And obviously they need to, you can't just speak up and say you have an opinion against it. You need to bring up your own data, right? And express your own problems. And there are people who have been a part of NASA for much longer, right? They saw the space shuttle era. They saw the two disasters that happened. They lived through that. And they probably wish they had other options back then. I think this is great. But to close out the thought for this episode, the unhealthy engineering environment is one in which data is not gathered correctly or critiqued in order to make sure that the data gathered is top-notch and that it's asking the right questions. Right? If they're not doing that, that's not great. And then if that one voice, right? Because it can take only one voice in that room of engineers and people who are responsible for understanding the physics and all the risk. If that room doesn't allow that one voice or more to express what they feel about that, that is a toxic environment. And it's not engineering at that point. That is human ego, and we're falling into the traps of what it is to be human. As far as moving forward, it could take multiple views. We talked about it before. We think it's very likely that they end up just moving the Starliner to another dock, having it stay there so that all the testing in the environment of space can happen. That can be done, and they get a much better understanding for the next time to whatever data NASA wants to gather to mitigate whatever risk that they're seeing. They would then be able to, instead of waiting for the next Starliner to be built and then launched and tested, right? Let's make the most of this. You know where we stand on this. We want to know where you stand on this. And if you've stayed this far in this episode, thank you so much. You're amazing. And so we want to hear from you. So hit us up on social media, Today in Space Pod, on Instagram, on Twitter, and obviously hit us up at Today in Space on TikTok, and email us at todayinspacepodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We're also floating the idea of maybe doing a call-in line for questions. I don't know if you guys are interested in that. Let me know. Hit me up. But I think that would be really cool. But that's it, folks. That is the Boeing Starliner situation and what it kind of means to be an engineer in the room. And I'm using my experience to extrapolate what it might be like in the room right now for those NASA and Boeing folks. So the best thing that can happen from a scientific perspective is that the best data is gathered and the best analysis of the risk is done, and that there is a clear and open discussion about all of the risks. And if there are people who disagree with the risk rating, they need to bring their own data to fight that back. It cannot just be a feeling or a gut check of how I feel about this. You need to be able to show your work, right? And that is how we think a healthy engineering environment can be. Now, I 100% understand that that might not be for everybody, and that is why a lot of people get burned out and don't end up being engineers full-time all the time, and that's totally fine. But if you're not an engineer, maybe give you an insight, maybe it helped you make some connections to stuff you're dealing with yourself. I mean, even though engineering seems to be so niche and specific, there's a lot of relations to real life in there as well. So that's it, folks. We wish the teams all the best as they figure this out and make the best option for this crew. And the amazing thing is we have another operational spacecraft that's human rated that can bring them home. So we don't have to make the Hail Mary call each time. That's it, folks. Spread love, spread science, be well, and we'll see you in the next episode of Today in Space. See ya.